Okay, the next Enlightenment movement that we should consider in your outline, B, Thomas Reid and Scottish common sense realism. Common sense realism, the Scottish school, was influential not only in Scotland among Presbyterians in particular, but all the more in American Presbyterianism. And one thinks here of the example of John Witherspoon, who had a part in the early founding of our country, Declaration of Independence and so forth. Scottish common sense realism. The first realist that we'll look at is Thomas Reid. Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796, who was a Scot and an influential opponent of David Hume, who was also a Scot. Okay, so you have Scottish Hume being now opposed by Scottish Thomas Reid. Thomas Reid was a Presbyterian minister. He became regent in the University of Aberdeen in 1751, and then a professor at Glasgow in 1764. Reid promoted an empirical epistemology without John Locke's intervening representational ideas. I think that's the easiest way to summarize the epistemology of the common sense realist. He has an empirical epistemology, an empirical theory of knowledge, but without John Locke's intervening representational ideas. Can we go back to Locke for a minute? Remember, Locke says the human mind doesn't know the world out there, it knows ideas of the world out there, and these ideas are supposed to represent or reflect their objects. So there's an object, an apple, which creates an idea in my mind, and what I know is the idea in my mind. So there's a intervening representational idea between me and the object. Y'all remember that? Shake your heads if you're awake. Good. And what Thomas Reid does is he rejects this intervening idea. He says sense impressions are not copies of the world, but sense impressions make immediate contact with real objects. Sense impressions make immediate contact with real objects. Consequently, for Thomas Reid, reality is what it appears to the senses. He doesn't have the problem now of the other empiricists that we only know appearances of the world. He says we know the world directly. We're in contact with the objects of the world directly. So reality is what it appears to the senses. And not only that, the objects of sensation exist independent of our experience of them. That is, by the way, technically what realism means in the modern phase of philosophy. Realism in medieval philosophy meant that universals exist independently. But realism in the days of the Enlightenment comes to be the view that the objects of perception exist independently of the mind. And so the school is known as common sense realism. Common sense meaning the way the world appears is the way the world is. Realism, because the objects that appear to me exist independently of their appearing to me. So who is he standing over against when he says the objects exist independently of their appearance to me, independently of my perception of them? I'm sorry? Over against Berkeley. Exactly right. So there's a real world of objects out there, And I know them directly, not via ideas that represent them or reflect them. Well, how do we know that the world is as it appears to us? How can we be sure of this? And the answer of Thomas Reid is we know this intuitively, that is, we know it directly, or better, he put it this way, we know it by common sense. Common sense. These convictions of ours about a world of objects that are as they appear to us is justified by universal consent. Universal consent. That's what common sense means. It's the sense, the intuition, the direct apprehension that all men have in common. Common sense, intuition. It's justified by universal consent. Why should there be such universal consent about there being a world of real objects that we know directly, not just the appearances of them? He said it is rooted in the constitution of our nature. That's why it's universal. All men have it constituently in their nature to consent to the idea of there being a world of objects that we know and not just the appearances of them. Yes? Well, I think it'd be a very worthwhile term paper or project or even doctoral dissertation for somebody to trace out the connections between this Presbyterian minister's exegesis and his philosophical claims about universal consent and common sense and so forth. I can't give you the specific answer of how he would have approached Romans 1. I can tell you, I was going to say this in a moment, but I'll tell you now, that this school of thought is universally disdained among philosophers. And though he's a Presbyterian minister and this way of thinking was influential in the founding of my country and all that, as a philosopher, I have to tell you, this is not good philosophy. Here we have all these complicated problems that have risen, through continental rationalism and British empiricism and so forth. And though they didn't make a direct move to this conclusion in this way, but it comes down to this. Well, we really do know the world, and there are objects. And how do we know that we know? By common sense. Everybody agrees that we know this world and so forth. But that's not much of an argument when you think about it. Common sense. Let me show you just one of the problems with common sense is. The world is as it appears to our senses, right? Well, I'm now holding up a quarter in front of you, and I'm holding it, as we say, flat to the audience. What do your senses tell you about the configuration of that quarter? You're all going to say, well, it's round. Okay? Now, I think you all believe, by common sense, you haven't seen me do any magic tricks with my hands here. I've got the same quarter in my hand. Now, how does it look to you? I'm not holding it flat to the audience. And now, don't make corrections from what you expect. If you're actually being perceptual, you'll tell me the quarter looks what? Oval. Right. So which is it? Shall we say, is it rational to say that oval and circle are identical? No. But perceptually, I've got one object that has both configurations. Now, which is it? I'm just trying to show you how naive common sense realism is as a philosophy. I don't disagree that there is a world of objects. I don't disagree that the way the world appears to us is basically what reality is. I just don't think you can get to it directly by appealing to the common conviction of mankind that is rooted in their nature. By the way, if it does work to say that that common conviction is rooted in the nature of man, then from a philosophical standpoint, we have to ask, how do we know what the nature of man is? So it's not just common sense, ultimately, is it? On this basis, on this approach, the only basis you could have is to say God has revealed to us what the common nature of man is. Okay, I mean, as it goes, I'm not against appealing to revelation. But obviously, in appealing to revelation, you're not appealing to common sense anymore, are you? And moreover, if you're going to appeal to revelation to tell you what the constitution of human nature is, in which is grounded this universal consent, then why don't you just appeal to revelation to prove that there's a world of real objects that we know with our senses? I mean, why go the long way around the barn? If you're going to go to Revelation and do the whole thing. Anyway, so I hope you can see, even if you have sympathies for their conclusions and for their religious convictions, the Scottish common sense realists were fairly naive in terms of their approach to philosophy. Reid wrote a book in 1764 entitled Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense. Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense. And in it he said, the sensations that we have are natural signs, not arbitrary or mere verbal signs in our mind, but they are natural signs of their objects. And you'll like this, even though, again, it's just an assertion, not a proof. He said these natural signs in our minds are much more powerful than any theory. Theories are enchantment with words, he called them. And so you get somebody like David Hume coming along, and he may theoretically argue against these natural signs and so forth. But according to Reid, the natural signs are more powerful than any enchantment with words. Well, again, we're sympathetic to this because we don't like the skepticism of Hume. But is that an answer to the skeptic? You tell the skeptic, I have these natural signs. I have sensations, perceptions of the world out there, and they are so convincing to me that I don't care what your philosophy says, your enchantment with words, your theories. I'm more convicted about my perceptions than about your philosophy. Yeah, but that's not an answer. Would David Hume agree that you're more convicted by your perceptions than by any philosophical theory? Yeah, remember we just saw, he says that's true too. He goes, my theory doesn't allow for absolute certainty. I have to be skeptical about everything, but I can't live that way. Instinctively, I've got to act as though there's causation, enduring objects, and so forth. And so, in one sense, Reid is not answering Hume, he's joining forces with Hume. He goes, I've got this instinct that forces me to believe this way. Okay, let's move on. A second Scottish common sense realist is Dugald Stewart. Dugald, Dugald Stewart, Stewart, 1753 to 1828. 1753 to 1828. He was born in Edinburgh and studied under Thomas Reid. According to Stewart, one's existence and personal identity, the existence of a world with general laws which will continue to operate are, and I quote, the fundamental laws of human belief. Let me say that again. One's existence and personal identity, the existence of a world with general laws which will continue to operate, are the fundamental laws of human belief.